time heals all wounds. However, the impact of grief, depending on that grief, it could be a traumatic experience. Well, time may not heal the wound because of the magnitude of the loss. If there was a violent death, how do you really heal from that?
Today on Bets and Badges, we're joined by Dr. Karen Reed, pastor in Miami Richmond Heights community, also a recent PhD grad who is a grief specialist, to discuss and take a deeper dive into grief and unresolved grief, which is commonly known as complex grief. I am Robert Asensio, and to the end of the table here, we have my co-host, retired police chief David Magnuson, and military historian. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great. I hope you all are, and I'm here to learn something. I really want to learn something. So let's get with it. Let's get into it.
Absolutely. So, Doctor, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
What is grief?
So grief is, it is what you described as far as experiencing the losses that we go through, not just in death, but daily loss of job, death, loss of a car, loss of anything that brings upon grief. We carry it in our bodies. Particularly, you spoke about unresolved grief. I'd like to coin it with the term disenfranchised grief, as far as that it's not recognized. It's not as recognizable to the masses. So it's a grief that may not hit the daily news, but it is that grief that you carry within yourself daily that you may not make known to your family, or your family may know. You may not make known to your coworkers or your friends. But grief is suffering a loss.
What are your thoughts on grief? I mean, we've had plenty of it in our lines of careers.
And we have, and it doesn't have to be necessarily, as you said, a very public thing. It can be grief that your best friend just retired and you're not going to be with that person anymore. I mean, it can elevate to different levels, and now I'm learning something, and it seems to have struck a chord with me. I understand fully. It could be that car issue. It could be something that happened, work-related now, that your vacation that you were looking forward to with the family has to be canceled because there's going to be a big activity coming into that city. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, I'm sure there's different levels. That would be on the minor thing, but it's still grief. It still affects you, and I think that's what I'm understanding from you.
Yes, there are variations of grief, mm-hmm. and so there's a saying that is commonly stated: "Time heals all wounds." However, the impact of grief, depending on that grief, it could be a traumatic experience. Well, time may not heal the wound because of the magnitude of the loss. If there was a violent death, how do you really heal from that when you don't have the closure that you would like to have?
Yeah. You know, when we met, that you mentioned about your background and what your studies were in, a topic, you know, it hit me because David and I have been running Bets and Badges for a better part of 6 months now, discussing with many of our colleagues, former colleagues, veterans, first responders, and stakeholders about the issues of personal wellness, right? And how do we address those struggles that we all have? So we are here speaking with others and gaining their perspective, listening to their stories, but also seeking answers. And what struck me was that I hadn't really considered grief as more than a loss of a loved one, you know, loss of life. And that grief, as you pointed out, can be just everyday losses.
Mm-hmm.
So I ask you, how common is unresolved grief in our communities?
Every day. It's a challenge every day. When you're served with an eviction notice on the door, then grief sets in, right? Or, like we said, the loss of job or shifting in the family. Perhaps there's a family member that has now taken ill. Well, there's a shifting in your daily activity, your life. And so grief sets in because now you're shifting into a whole different dimension that you may not have been prepared for. So it becomes that place of what you're speaking of, unresolved. Whereas, how do I find a resolution to this, and how do I heal or go through a healing from this, or will I ever recover and heal from this?
Let's go back to whether in the military or on the police job, firefighter, or somebody that deals with the public, somebody deals with tragedy. So we go to the scene. We talked about this plenty. We go to the scene. Our colleagues go into the scene. They're meeting with people on a day-to-day basis, and definitely not at their best, right? Situations of people generally at their worst. Let's look at it from both sides, from the person in uniform and the citizen. We come back compounded every day, year after year, career-wise, right? That impact. How do we deal with? I'm asking you, what would you suggest as far as techniques, resources to go to for us to better deal with what we may not realize we're dealing with, or when we do realize we're dealing with something, to be able to overcome the obstacles that are created because of these feelings, these losses, these experiences that we're having?
Yeah, so the healthy mechanisms that we need in order to be able to cope, survive, and live. And so there is an author, Resmaa Menakem, who specifically spoke about the trauma of his grandmother. My grandmother's hands is what he called it. And he spoke about the collectivity of bodies coming together in a circle, perhaps. He described his grandmother would always rock to deal with the trauma that she dealt with in her life. However, there are many facets, whereas, like I said, collectivity, coming together and having a circle of support of like minds who are also dealing with similar situations and being able to create a safe space to speak about it. Finding those outlets that will bring relief to you and bring healing, such as if it's playing the guitar or playing that instrument. Perhaps it's your hard rock music or it's the classical that will also calm the body, that will soothe the body and calm the nerves. So, because we have triggering effects. No one knows when it's going to hit. Grief doesn't tell you, okay, well, I'm coming to visit you tomorrow. It just pops up on the scene. And sometimes it takes our mind into places that you imagine on the job where somebody's working, and then all of a sudden you think about the loss. How do you channel that? And so our human responsibility in society needs to take ownership of offering more time off for those who are dealing and suffering, more resources. There's a lack of resources that deal specifically with grief, and there's so many variations, but there are enough resources in the world to do so. It's just being able to access it. So society, jobs, churches, the schools, the academy, actually need to take a deeper dive in helping to create a healthier and a better world by creating these spaces for humanity to be able to cope and to deal. So finding that outlet that will speak to the individual. Everybody's different. So my coping mechanism may be different from yours, but we have to create a safe space. And it starts here with, this community coming together and being able to share and talk about it. This is real life. This is what people deal with daily. How often do we go back and speak or find those who are still suffering from September 11th?
Yeah. What are your thoughts, David? Because this is a deeper thought, man, than what we have pretty much discussed lately.
Grief, right? Let's talk vicarious grief.
Yes.
Officers on the scene, they may not have they may not know personally
Right.
the people that maybe got gunned down or in a car accident, but they're there watching family members arrive. That grief, it flows out.
Yes.
You have to think for police officers, right? Fire department as well. They're absorbing a lot of that grief vicariously, right? They're carrying it around. They may not know it, but we've said this on other shows too. I mean, you can't let everything get you down on that in this job, but to say it didn't bother you or doesn't bother you or hasn't affected you in some shape or form, I don't think would be quite honest. And for those that it doesn't bother, you wonder, what's the weight they're carrying?
Right.
And so I fully understand that. Because for officers, for whatever the reason is, like I said, shootings, right? Car accident, maybe a death notification. You're there for people, you might not know them, but you're there absorbing their grief.
Right.
And it has to take its toll in this job. For that in fire department too.
Yeah, and frontline workers, right?
Right. Hospital,
Hospitals,
correct.
ER.
Correct.
And doctor, look at it from the community's perspective. Like, so the police are coming into, or fire, whomever coming into the community, things are not at the best. Tempers are flared, emotions are through the roof. What is the sentiment from the community side when these people are coming in? And it can only maybe be made worse if the responder is not sympathetic.
Right.
Or maybe is sympathetic and just says the wrong thing because to that person, triggers a person. It could be the right thing to say, but it triggers that person. How do we overcome that? I mean, we'll start with what's the sentiment, and can you walk us through that? How does that add to the grief, and how do we learn? What can you tell us to, like, what steps it take to overcome those type of situations?
I may not necessarily be able to give the steps to overcome those situations.
What would you suggest?
But I suggest that conversations like this in the community, bringing all parties to the table, and having that shared conversation, having that and explaining on both sides. So there is an understanding how the officer is supposed to respond, and okay, the officer can hear the community's reaction or feel the emotion of the community, so that the response may not be may not feel as intimidating or feel like a threat, but there is a deeper understanding. I just believe that society, we all have to be active listeners. How do we do that? But
is that occurring now?
And I know it's not.
Let's talk about that.
So actively listening to hear what is being said and what's not being said, and taking a deeper dive, and that entails breathing through the intensity of the situation. And I may be going out on a limb here, but for our frontliners,
I like that. Frontliners. It's
difficult to witness a shooting or operate on someone who came in with a bullet wound, firefighters going in to rescue, and then you rise and you go back at it the next day without talking about it.
Or you go home.
Or you go home. And how does your family also deals with that, right? Your family also deals with that intensity. So those are the places where we have to have deeper conversations, or not even deeper conversations, but simple conversations, but giving everyone the space to breathe, and exhale and yell if they want to, because it could get so heavy.
Hey,
Like,
hey,
how
hey,
do you
don't yell at me. Don't yell at me.
But how do you expect someone to withhold that? And then when explosion happens, it splatters all over the place.
It's like the pot on the stove. If that lid's on and there's no safety valve,
Right.
ultimately that lid's going into the ceiling.
Right.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah.
But I believe that if the community and those on the front line, police officers, firefighters, hospital administration, to be able to answer those questions, talk about policies and procedures so there is a better understanding, but then also knowing that the community is going through an emotion, and also it ties back to history, right? Whatever the history of the country is, whatever the history of that neighborhood is, being able to make that connection and say, okay, I understand your history. I understand why it is what it is. And then it gives us a better response.
Having a greater sense of humanity, I'd say.
Yes.
David, I mean, what are your thoughts? Because I can think of a lot of times where I have messed up personally.
Yeah.
I have missed that mark.
But haven't we all?
I guess you're
Well, like anything else and everything else, the answers are oftentimes lay in the past, lay in the history.
Yeah.
Get to the root cause, right? You're going to read a book, look at the bibliography, get back to the primary source. That's where the truth lays. Now, not everybody does it, not everybody can do it or has the time to do it, but that truth is there. Right?
Yes.
And it's just a matter of, whatever you can do to, like you said, get that weight off you, lift that burden off you, right? Exhale.
Yes.
I get it.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then, like I was sharing with you, I wanted to talk about the unresolved grief for women, right? Look, I think it's fair to say most women carry a heavier burden than men, especially when there's family and, the man's out there earning the living, but the woman's also earning the living. She's also taking care of the kids, being responsible for the house, at times the man, and it's not just an equal partner at times. And I am one that I have forgotten that over the years and had to be reminded. So let's talk about unresolved grief amongst women. Is that? I guess it's always been there, right? Constant.
Right. Women are bearers of culture. And so bearing, as you said, the family, or making sure that dinner's on the table.
I don't want to be overly stereotypical, but let's face it, the reality is most women are caretakers.
Yes. And so the weight gets heavy. And how does she cope? And in the age now, because mental illness was not very prominent maybe 20 years ago, but now, today, it is. And so how does she cope? How does she manage? How does she get through? And so another place to look at the single moms, those who are trying to make it through, those who are restricted. When we look at women of color, underrepresented in statistics, and so statistics may not include women of color in those facets. And so the economic stress, making sure the rent or the mortgage is paid, trying to achieve a better education for herself or training. And so this is the place where the world says, okay, it's the age of the women now, and women are rising, but there's still a place where there's a misrepresentation of what women carry and the endurance of what they have to endure and the obstacles and the hoops that they have to jump over. We.
It's never ending, right?
It's never ending. And I don't want to sound like so gender specific, but I mean, the statistics and facts are there. I mean, when you're underpaid, when you're not paid as equal, but you have the qualifications that measure up, how do you, and you still show up for work and you give your 100%, but there's a misrepresentation of who you are.
And that's a form of grief too, right?
That is a form of grief.
All right.
Because you show up, and I'll call it this. W.E.B. Du Bois spoke about it for Black women, and I'll use his phrase as far as a dual consciousness. So I may have a mask on and I have a smile on my face. That's the mask. But behind my mask, I am sad. I am not happy. But in order to perform, I'm giving you what needs to be seen. So it's a dual consciousness. It's like, which side are you dealing with?
And if you don't have understanding, especially if you're in that relationship, you're the other person in that relationship, and you don't have understanding, that can create a very toxic life, right?
It is a very toxic life.
And no wonder we have so many freaking divorces and so many breakups and so many fights.
And worse.
Yeah.
And worse.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have 7 minutes left. What are your thoughts? So where do we go from here? How do we expand on this conversation? And how do we bring it to light and hopefully create some level of hope that there's a way to change and overcome these levels of grief?
So there's possibilities of hope always. It's every day that you rise up, every day we rise with breath in our body, it gives us another day and another opportunity to be able to transcend over the grief. And so I would say grief doesn't fully overtake us. It is present, but there is possibility of being able to live through it and to be able to still be successful and to achieve dreams and to be able to go forward. How do we move from here is we continue to have conversations like this and spread it throughout the world. And then taking it to different communities and creating a space for people to grieve. Create that space for them to grieve. Society, the police department, perhaps can create a deeper space for the officers to grieve, so we can have a better communication or relationship with communities, with our police officers. Then perhaps our communities won't feel so threatened because there is an understanding there that this person is coping this way. I don't have to pull out, or I don't have to intimidate them with the gun. You understand what I'm saying? But the deeper conversations, taking it to the schools, the churches, and the communities, deeper dive.
You think the stigma's the same as, in this case, stigma of grief, personal fight with grief and overcoming grief is the same as the stigma with seeking help for what we've been talking about, mental health?
I see the commonality here. It's changing mindsets. Not just for others, starting with yourself, changing mindsets. And I think it's one and the same. The stigma we've talked about in many of the episodes, one had to rise above that and change their mindset to take that first step. I mean, and we've gone through that, and what compelled them to take that first step? What happened? Where did they, cross the Rubicon, so to speak, to do what they didn't do before? There was a mindset change. And here with, if I'm speaking personally about myself, going through whatever grief it may be, to change that mindset, to maybe listen more, or to open up a door and say, listen, this isn't doing me any good. Let me see what I can do to get better. Would that be spot on?
Absolutely. Our human responsibility, taking on our human responsibility as well. Active listening, like you're saying, listening more, and taking that step back. And when we listen more, then we're able to respond better. We're able to act upon it better or judge better, instead of just moving on impulse. And that's for everyone. That's for everyone.
So, are you able to identify for the audience the signs of grief that a person would experience? I know it's not the same for everybody, but just general signs. There have to be some general signs, right?
There could be, but that goes back to the dual consciousness that I just described, whereas you may not be able to tell because you show up for work and you are expected to produce. So who's expecting you to bring that grief in there of a loss of a car, not the loved one, but a loss of a car or a loss of a house, loss of position, and so how do you channel through that? So the signs of that grief may not really be there. And so it would take us to actually deeply listen and actually look at the production of the person. Are they still performing on this same level, or has there been a change? It would take some evaluating to do.
On an individual basis.
Yeah, because we could mask it. That's what society does. We mask things. Social media has taught us so well to do that.
On that note, we're down to just under 2 minutes, actually just over 2 minutes. Any closing thoughts, David?
I think there's a lot to absorb. Like you said, with the mask, and sometimes we can't get past it. Talking to other people, I think it's very important, the self-awareness, to know when we're wearing that mask, and to do what we can with whoever will help us to remove that mask, whatever that is, like we talked about. And I know that's minuscule in the overall scheme of things, the car. Unless that's the only way you can get around, then it's not so minuscule, right? And so what's minor to some it may be very major to others, right. And that may really throw them for a loop. And you say, well, in the overall scheme of things, yeah, but look, it's not like somebody passed or something. Yeah, but you don't know the pain they're going through. So that's the active listening. I get you.
Absolutely.
Closing
and
thoughts
there goes with that variations of grief. And that's what I would leave with us today, that there are variations of grief. And so someone's magnitude may not be your magnitude, but to give us respect for it, and not overlook it, but really realize that it is real, and grief is real. We all endure it. We all we carry it daily, but we are able to cope, and we are able to survive. We're able to live through it.
There you go. So the only thing I can say is, for those of you out there, if you're experiencing grief and you don't have another place to go to, drop us a line, info@vetsandbadges.com. We will find help. We'll collaborate with a good doctor here to find you some resources. But at the end of the day, I think, losses are normal in life. It's just that what's not normal, I guess, it's the threshold. Like some people take harder hit losses, and then when you have repeated losses, certainly adds to the hardship of everyday life.
Absolutely.
And you shouldn't suffer alone, because you're not alone. I think that's the word, right? We're not alone, or that's the phrase, we're not alone. I want to make sure everybody knows that. On that note, we'd like to thank the Miami's Community News team, Grant Michael Miller, the Community News team, our producer, Alex Sukas, behind the scenes. Go Alex. My co-host, David Magnuson, and our great guest, Dr. Karen Reed.
Thank you.
Worship Pastor, Dr. Karen Reed.
Reverend Dr. Karen Reed.
There you go. All right. If somebody wants to get a hold of you, would you like to
Okay, you can reach me at the Purple Church, Miami. We're on Facebook. We have a website, www.thepurplechurch.org. The church is literally purple. You can also contact us at 305-251-6232.
Outstanding. Thank you for that. This has been another episode of Bets and Badges. If you would like more about us, you can visit us on betsandbadges.com or on YouTube. Besides the Miami Community News Network, we're on most podcast platforms: Apple, Spotify, iHeart, Amazon. Reach us out under Bets and Badges. If you don't get it, it is Bets and Badges. Thank you, and look forward to the next one.